Hi, good morning, everyone. This is Leah with Headwaters Science Institute, and welcome to Lunch with a Scientist, your opportunity to see what a STEM career is like and see some insight into some scientific research. Today we have Dr. Ashley Pierce joining us. Hi, Ashley.
Hello, good morning. Good morning-ish.
Good morning. It is morning for us. For
Yeah.
Ashley, she's in a different time zone. Where are you, Ashley?
I am in Washington, D.C., so it's 2 p.m. over here.
Awesome. Well, we're so glad to have you. Ashley is a special member of the Headwaters family. She is our former grants coordinator. She's a mentor right now during our summer research program, and she's done a lot of teaching during our in-person programs in past years. So we're so happy to be able to feature her research today. She's an environmental scientist. She has a background in atmospheric pollutants, specifically mercury, ozone, and particulate matter. She has a master's and a PhD in environmental science, and she is now an AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow at the National Science Foundation. So today, she's going to share more about her journey in science and her work studying mercury in the environment. So without further ado, Ashley, I will let you take it away.
Great. Thank you, Leah. Yes, I am also happy to be here. Headwaters has a special place in my heart. So happy to be here and happy to talk to you all. And as Leah said, I'm going to talk about mercury in the environment, and I'm an environmental scientist. And often when I tell people that I work on mercury, the first question I get is the planet. And no, I'm not a mercury scientist, or a space scientist on Mercury, although that would be great. I also don't study Mercury in Greek or Roman mythology, nor do I study Freddie Mercury, although that would be great, lead singer of Queen. What I study is the element mercury, which is right here on the periodic table. And this, as you can see, mercury is in the transition metal section of the periodic table. And this placement in the periodic table gives mercury some really unique characteristics. Mainly that mercury is the only metal that's liquid at room temperature, which means that it's also fairly volatile. It can go from the liquid to the gas phase pretty easily. And the position in the periodic table gives it some unique electron configuration, which I won't go into a lot of detail about, but it basically means that mercury acts sometimes like a noble gas more than a metal. It forms weak bonds, and it is very good at sticking to other metals like gold and silver. It's also very dense. It doesn't conduct heat very well, and it's a fair conductor of electricity. But before we get into why these characteristics make mercury unique and also make it a fairly dangerous element, we're going to talk a little bit about where mercury comes from. So mercury is naturally occurring. It occurs in cinnabar, which is that red rock that you see on the screen there. And cinnabar occurs naturally across the globe, although it is fairly rare. It's not quite as rare as gold and silver. And it's also what forms vermilion, which is a pigment, a red pigment that was used over 30,000 years ago in Paleolithic painters, by Paleolithic painters in Spain and France. So it's been around and been used for a really long time. And the way that you get mercury from, you have to extract mercury from cinnabar to get that metallic liquid mercury. And that form of mercury has been used throughout history, dating back to at least 2,000 years before the Common Era. And it's been used in things like tombs in Central America and in China around the terracotta soldiers, if you're familiar with those. It's also used in thermometers, barometers, and manometers, so measuring temperature and liquid and gas pressure. It's used in fluorescent lights, and it's a more efficient light than an incandescent bulb, which is great. But if you break the fluorescent bulbs, that can be a problem. It's used in batteries and dentistry. So dentistry uses amalgams to cap molars. So if you're anyone over 40, 50 years old, it's possible that you have some mercury in your amalgam in your teeth. It's also had medicinal uses. It was thought to cure different diseases, although it likely does not. It was also used in cosmetics to address aging. It's also used as a preservative on things like food and on felt. So it was used in felt for hats, which is how we get the Mad Hatter in Alice in Wonderland, and in mining. And so, as I mentioned before, it tends to stick to other metals. So it's very often used in gold and or silver mining. It sticks to the silver and the gold that's extracted from the earth, and then it's very good at binding to those things. And then you can heat up the gold and mercury, or the silver and mercury amalgam, and that will release mercury from that liquid state into the gas state. And then all you have left is the gold or mercury. So often, any of the jewelry that you're wearing, silver or gold, will probably have had mercury used to extract it from the ground. So we have these natural sources of mercury in the cinnabar, and then our human applications of the mercury extract it from the earth. And then in these extractions, we often get mercury released into the environment. So we have, on the left side, sources of mercury, natural, sometimes from volcanoes or erosion from the natural occurring cinnabar deposit in the earth. But more often we get human sources of mercury, and those sources of mercury will release mercury into the air or into terrestrial or water ecosystems. And once mercury gets into the air, it can travel long distances. It sometimes stays in the air for 6 months to over a year. And it can deposit into ecosystems far away from any sources. So it'll fall out of the air either onto land or to water ecosystems. And once it gets into an ecosystem, and specifically aquatic ecosystems, mercury tends to latch on to particles in the sediments. And then in the sediments, we have bacteria that can change the mercury from whatever form it was when it entered the aquatic system into a form of mercury called methylmercury. And methylmercury is particularly problematic because it is available to biological processes, which means that organisms can pick up the mercury and the mercury will stay in those organisms. So you have the bacteria changing the mercury into a form of mercury that can be uptaken by, say, small organisms like phytoplankton. And those phytoplankton will then get eaten by slightly larger organisms like zooplankton. And those zooplankton will get eaten by, small organisms, small fish. And in each one of these steps, as it goes from these very small organisms to slightly larger organisms to small fish, and then eventually to large fish and large predators, eagles, humans. At every step there, you get mercury accumulating as it goes up the food chain. So the phytoplankton and the zooplankton have very low levels of mercury. But once you get to a large predator, you get pretty high levels of mercury. And that's where the problems happen for environments, for organisms, and for particularly large predators like us. So why do we care about that? Mercury is a neurotoxin, which means it negatively impacts brain function. So it will attack the nervous system and cause issues with balance in low levels of mercury, with memory, all the way up to causing developmental issues. So certain forms of mercury, like the methylmercury that I mentioned previously, easily crosses biological barriers. So once you ingest seafood with a lot of mercury, that mercury can travel through your blood and it can cross the barrier into your brain. And it can also cross the barrier, the placental barrier, which means for women who are pregnant, the mercury can affect their developing children. So there are a couple of high-profile instances where we see mercury contamination throughout the world. In the 1950s, industrial wastewater containing high amounts of mercury was dumped by the Chiso Corporation into the Minamata Bay in Japan, where the local community relied on the seafood coming out of the bay. And over the next couple of years and into the 1970s, the local community suffered a lot of detrimental impacts from the mercury coming from the seafood out of that bay. Also in the 1970s, there was wheat seed treated with methyl mercury that was sent from Mexico to Iraq. Iraq was experiencing a drought. And so this seed was treated with methyl mercury to keep it fresh as it made the travel from Mexico to Iraq. And the seed was meant for planting. It was drought resistant. Unfortunately, the seed arrived in Iraq too late for the planting season, and the seed instead was fed to chickens and animals, and then it was also made into wheat and bread that was then consumed by humans. And again, the local community suffered negative impacts from this mercury. And more recently, we often hear about mercury in seafood. And this comes about in seafood warnings for high mercury content in seafood, and often for children and pregnant or nursing women, again, because that methyl mercury causes negative impacts on your brain. So we have these human applications that release mercury into the atmosphere. And then mercury ends up in a local ecosystem. But we also have, we have those two kind of high profile cases in Japan and in Iraq, where large amounts of mercury were released to a local ecosystem. But these seafood warnings tend to be ubiquitous. We have seafood warnings across the United States and globally. And this goes for seafood that's far from any large sources of mercury. So when we look at mercury emissions, we can see that the largest source of mercury is artisanal mining. So that picture I showed of the person holding mercury that had attached to gold or silver, that's what we consider artisanal mining. And then also you can see that the second is combustion of coal. So that would be coal-fired power plants. So these are the largest emitters of mercury, and they're emitting a form of mercury into the atmosphere that is that form of mercury that can last in the air for 6 months to up to a year, and therefore can travel globally. And that's how we get mercury in seafood in places where we don't have very obvious dumping of high concentrations of mercury. So if we go and look at another graphic, this one's not quite as pretty as the last one I showed, but it's a graphic we published a couple years back trying to understand the processes of mercury as it travels around the globe. There are a lot of different reactions and atmospheric processes that go on. And so what we found is that there are a lot of different forms of mercury in the atmosphere and in environments. And what you'll see on this graphic are the bold GEM, GEOM, PBM. Those are all different forms of mercury. And we don't need to know the specifics on that, but to know that those are a various number of different forms of mercury. But the gaseous elemental mercury makes up most of the mercury in the atmosphere and tends to travel the furthest from any sources, which means that there's a global distribution of mercury. And that mercury in the air is the main source of mercury to remote environments, which is how we find it in our seafood across the globe. And concentrations right now in the air of mercury are 3 to 10 times higher than pre-industrial concentrations. So industrial processes and applications that humans have been using mercury for have been taking mercury out of the natural sources around the globe and putting it into the air at higher concentrations than it's been previously. And as the mercury enters into the air, there are a lot of unknown processes that we still don't fully understand. And current measurement methods are problematic. They tend to be biased low in measuring mercury, and they also tend to only measure one form of mercury. So we're not getting the full picture. So my research was focused mainly on developing new methods for measuring mercury in the air, which meant I spent a lot of time with really complicated instrumentation, trying to develop a method that would better quantify how much mercury is in the air and allow us to understand the different forms and the different processes going on. So this meant spending a lot of time traveling across Nevada, which is where I did most of my research, and loading these instruments into trailers, measurement trailers, and taking them out into the field and doing field measurement campaigns to try and determine whether or not the measurement methods we were developing were better or worse than the commonly used measurement methods, and to see if we could learn anything new in these different field sites. So what we learned was that it's very complicated to make a new method, which is why the current methods are the way they are. It takes a long time to develop measurement methods, and it takes a long time to understand complicated atmospheric processes. So if we move back to this graphic here, we have anthropogenic or human sources of mercury going into the air, and natural sources. So often those are going to be fires and volcanoes. Those emit mercury into the air, and then anything in a dotted box are going to be areas of uncertainty when measuring mercury. But really, we want to know how the mercury is getting into the environments and then into seafood. So before you go and worry about seafood and swear off seafood completely, it's important to understand that there are cost benefits to eating seafood. Like I said, those organisms that are higher in the food chain, so those large predators, those are going to be your swordfish, your marlin, your tuna, all of those things are large predators and they live a long time, and so they will have more mercury. So those are going to be in your bottom left corner of this graph. But seafood's also known to be beneficial and very healthy. It has high in omega-3 fatty acids, which are very good for you. So you're going to want to just make sure that you're paying attention to the seafood that you're eating, and look for seafood that's high in omega-3 fatty acids and low in mercury. So that's going to be your top right quadrant there, where you see salmon and mackerel. And so I'm not trying to scare anyone from eating seafood, but there are just things to pay attention to. And you can get a Seafood Watch booklet from the Monterey Bay Aquarium that takes into account your best seafood options based on mercury and other contaminants, and your less good seafood to eat, which are available. And so going back to the 3 high-profile mercury contaminants that I was discussing earlier, in going through an academic research track, working on something like mercury, what really was brought home to me was that in order to address global issues like mercury pollution, we really need local and regional regulation. So we need to understand that you can't just dump contaminants into a local ecosystem. And that requires communication. So that requires communication to the people using things like mercury, and it requires communication to the local, the people in the local area. And then this photograph from Minamata Bay was taken by a photographer. And so you need communication through different forms. And it wasn't until the 1970s when Eugene Smith, the photographer, went to Minamata Bay and captured the local impacts that this issue really came to light, to the public light. And then if you think about the wheat seed that was sent to Iraq, you need international agreements and communication to make sure that the information on dangers are communicated to across national boundaries. So you'll notice the language on that bag is in Spanish because the wheat seed was coming from Mexico, but it wasn't ever translated into the local language in Iraq. And so nobody knew that you weren't supposed to eat the wheat seed. Nobody knew that it had mercury on it. And so communication and international agreements are important in that sense. Then when you think about mercury in seafood globally, you really need communication and education to understand what type of seafood is better to eat, what type of seafood might have higher concentrations of mercury, and why. And the warnings and the issues need to be clearly communicated. And so this has really formed how I am as a scientist and my future goals and path in science. So as Leah mentioned, I am an environmental scientist. I have a master's and a PhD in environmental science from both from the University of Nevada in Reno. And I have transitioned a little bit to more science adjacent because it seems throughout my career that science education and science communication has been quite important in dealing with global pollution. So I've also, as mentioned, worked with Headwaters Science Institute to develop education programs. And currently I'm a AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow at the National Science Foundation, where I get to bring my science background to the table in the federal government. And I think with that, I will wrap up and say thank you and take any questions.
Thank you very much, Ashley.
Thank you.
That was great. So yes, if you're watching and you have questions for Ashley, please type them into the comments here. And I am going to kick us off with a question that came up while I was hearing you talk. I wondered, how do you go about determining a suitable field site for measuring mercury in the air?
That's a great question. So it really depends on what you're trying to measure. So a lot of what I was trying to measure was background concentrations, so concentrations of mercury away from any pollution. And so if you're familiar with Nevada, a lot of Nevada is fairly rural. And so our sites tended to be out in the middle of nowhere. And that was the best way and to get at background mercury concentrations. And so that also required having a range of different field sites. So we had field sites in valleys and field sites at the top of a mountain, as you saw in that, you can see in that last picture. That's one of our field sites. Yeah, and then the other consideration is are more practical, like we need to have power to run the instruments. So whether or not we have access to power is a huge limiter. There are some ways in which we get around that, where we have solar powered instrumentation, so we can put it wherever. But yeah.
That makes sense. And so I also wondered, going into the field, what is it like going from maybe doing lab work to becoming a field scientist, taking all your gear on the road and packing up? And can you give us some insight into that?
Yeah. So I did both throughout both of my degrees. You go out into the field and set up your instruments and collect samples, and then you bring them back to the lab and you analyze them. So I consider myself both a lab and a field researcher. So I don't know, you can be at one or the other, but they're really integrated. It takes a lot of planning and a lot of coordinating. So being in so many different areas in Nevada, obviously we couldn't be at every field site every day. So we had to very strategically plan out our field sites based, as I said before, on power, based on whether or not they would be a good measurement site. You want to know you want to make sure that you understand what's going on in that area and that you're not going to have, you know, an artisanal mine right next door throwing off your measurements if you're looking for background measurements. And then in order to maintain those sites, we were often coordinating with Forest Service, with Nevada Department of Environmental Protection. So you're coordinating a lot of different agencies who are supporting your research, which is great. You want the local authorities involved. You want people involved in your research and invested in it. And so it's a lot of planning. And then also Nevada's very large. So we would drive from Reno, Nevada to Great Basin National Park, which is on the far east side of Nevada. And that's about an 8-hour drive with very little service. And so, yeah, you had to plan to make sure that you had all the equipment you needed because you couldn't just run back to the lab and pick up something you'd forgotten. And we were often camping. So you had to be pretty self-reliant and have enough water so that you didn't get caught in the desert and all of those considerations.
That's fascinating. Sounds like a lot of time in the car to think about what you're going to be studying.
Yes, I listened to a lot of podcasts.
So, getting into the meat of your research on mercury pollution, we have a question from Mari who wants to know how many places across the US measure mercury in the atmosphere.
Mari, nice to hear from you. That is a great question, and I am not sure I know the answer of that, actually. There is a national and an international global mercury monitoring network. I unfortunately don't know the number of measurement sites they have, but mercury is a kind of a niche research, and there aren't nearly as many people out there measuring it as there should be.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. Well, Mari, that's something for you to go research also. So another question about studying, but this time on the regulation side, are there any international laws or treaties to prevent the emission and dumping of mercury, especially since it spreads across the world regardless of whether the country has regulations or not?
Yeah, so I believe it was 2000. I'm not going to remember the year. The Minamata Convention was signed. It's not a law, but it is an agreement, an international agreement to reduce mercury emissions. So we do have that, but I believe it doesn't have very much teeth. And then we do have things like HTAP, which is toxic air pollutant, shoot, I'm not going to remember the exact wording, but basically trying to reduce the transport of toxic pollutants across boundaries. And then we do regulate emission of mercury, and specifically mercury from point sources
Mm-hmm.
in the United States.
It's great to hear that we're doing something about it. So another question here, this one's from Meg, I believe. How do forest fires affect atmospheric mercury?
Yeah, so mercury, like I said, occurs naturally in the crust of the Earth, so in deposits across the Earth. And then it enters an environment and is uptaken by biological things in the environment as well. So things like trees and any kind of grass, all of those things, rice, will have some mercury in it. And as I said, it's also very volatile. So it'll quickly go from liquid or a particulate form and volatilize into gaseous mercury. So once you have a forest fire, it will be emitting gaseous mercury by burning any of that biomass, and also heating up the soil if there's mercury in the soil.
Interesting. I think forest fires are on our mind here in the Sierra Nevada region with all the hot summers. So
yes, and you get a lot of waste burning as a way to deal with solid waste, so our trash basically, and cremation as well. So you get mercury emitted from all sorts of biomass burning, whether it's natural or human biomass burning.
Interesting. So I'm curious about kind of your academic journey going back to you as a scientist as a whole. I noticed that you got both your undergraduate and graduate degrees at the University of Nevada, Reno. How did you know you wanted to study environmental science, and how did you go about picking your school?
Oh, that's a good question. So I actually did my undergraduate at the William and Mary in Virginia, and I was a major in biology and a minor in environmental science. And I took an art class at the College of William and Mary with a really wonderful professor who um, had somehow gotten involved in an interdisciplinary group at William and Mary looking at mercury as a global pollutant. And I was just taking her art class because I liked art. But she also knew I was a scientist, or I was in biology as a major. And so she got me involved with this program. And what we did was had a bunch of different we had a bunch of different classes looking at mercury as a global pollutant from the lens of each discipline. So I was in an art class and we looked at art and mercury. And then there were things like English classes looking at mercury, math classes looking at mercury, science classes looking at mercury. And at the end of it, we all came together and had a conversation about mercury, facilitated by the fact that each class was talking about mercury through the lens of that discipline. And so that got me involved just kind of randomly in mercury at William and Mary. And I did an internship, and then the year between my junior and senior year of undergrad, I wanted to do some sort of internship or work, and I wanted to be out west. And so I sent out my resume kind of randomly to a bunch of people and heard back from a professor at the Desert Research Institute in Reno, Nevada, which is it's part of the Nevada higher system of higher education. And so I did a summer internship out in Reno working on mercury, and then went back to William and Mary for my senior year, and ended up being offered by that professor that I had done my internship with a position in his master's program. And I hadn't really decided what I was going to do. I just knew I kind of wanted to go west and I wanted to be in science. And he offered me a position in his master's program. And the really great thing about graduate work in the science often is that they pay you to be there. So science is often funded by grants, oftentimes by the National Science Foundation. And so professors will sign up for a grant and they'll put in their grant a certain amount of money to pay for graduate students. And so that's what this professor had. He had a paid position for a grad student. And so I moved out to Reno and continued graduate work on mercury, having like 70 to 80% of my tuition paid, and also receiving a monthly stipend. So you come out of grad school with little to no debt because you're getting paid to be there, because you're being paid to do the research, but the research also is your grad work. So it's kind of a good feedback there. And then one of my committee members for my master's degree offered me a PhD position, which I took. So it was kind of, it wasn't necessarily that I chose Reno, Nevada. It's that it kind of worked out well.
Mhm. Yeah, it's fascinating. I think a lot of young people face challenges in affording their education in whatever form, and so to be paid to do the research that you already want to be doing that's a fascinating journey, and it sounds like it was really supportive.
Yes, I probably would not have done a PhD, at least, if it hadn't been part of the science support from grant money.
Mm.
Yeah, it's tough otherwise.
Right. So getting back to a couple audience questions here. What are the most pressing problems, in your opinion, that need to be solved by environmental scientists?
Oh, that's a hard-hitting question. um, yeah, so I think the most pressing problem right now is anthropogenic emissions of pollutants, and that is a whole wide range of pollutants from mercury to CO2 to methane to other toxic pollutants, and all of these things are, you know, are causing feedbacks that are causing other issues. So, yeah, atmospheric anthropogenic emissions of pollutants, and then also degradation of environments, different environments.
Mm-hmm. And so, looking forward to solving some of these problems, where is your research going?
Yeah, so I'm looking to pivot to a more science adjacent career path that is using science to inform decisions, and to open up lines of communication so that we can all talk about science, and use it where it's needed. So I don't know 100% where that's going to lead next. Right, as I said, right now I'm in the federal government using my scientific knowledge to help look at programs and ways to better fund science. So I'm hoping to continue along that line.
That's fascinating. Just continuing the feedback loop of spreading education. That's great.
Education and communication, yes.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Ashley Pierce, thank you so much for joining us. Again, if you didn't catch the beginning of the talk, Ashley is a special member of our family. She is currently mentoring in our summer research program. And I know we have Laura, one of our students, watching. Hi, Laura. Thanks for being here. And we just appreciate you so much. Thank you for your talk.
Thank you. Thanks for doing this. I really, support science education. So keep doing what you're doing.
All right. Have a good day, everybody.
Bye.